Well, thank you very much, Dr Simon Longstaff, AO, for joining us today and speaking with the OKGA.
Thank you. You will call me Simon.
I will call you Simon,
Good.
Thank you. And you founded the Ethics Centre, and of course you headed up. When did you decide that your passion was ethics? Was there sort of a light bulb moment, or did it just sort of evolve as an interest for you?
I think my first interest was in philosophy, and that was something which grew generally from the time I left school. Actually, I don't think I was that interested in it when I was at school, but certainly through a range of life experiences. My mother had died when I was very young, when I was 7, and then I went straight from school to Groote Eylandt and the Gulf of Carpentaria. I was exposed to a completely different world, and these things mixed together and said, well, you know, what's going on and how do you explain these things? So philosophy came first, and then I discovered Socrates, and of course his very profound question, which is at the heart of all ethics, at least in the Western tradition, which is what ought one to do? And from that point onwards, I was hooked.
And would you say that through your sort of experience at Knox, that anybody perhaps influenced some of your thinking and maybe sparked a bit of an interest in the meaning of life, if you like?
I think there are a number of people who actually equipped me quite well for a life in philosophy. There was a teacher called Noel Baldwin who taught me one of the most valuable lessons I think I've ever had, which is that it's perfectly okay to attack the argument, but not the person. And we didn't always live by those rules. We were quite mischievous in some ways, but he was certainly a contributor to that. Bruce Carter, who was the deputy head there and a housemaster at Ewan House where I was boarding, very influential, very urbane and civilised man who was interested in ideas, so that had an influence. And probably some of my fellow students too. We'd sit down and we'd talk about things, and occasionally ideas would come up about our lives and times. So, you know, it's very hard to put a finger on particular issues, although I've tried to identify a couple. But all of that was an important formation.
Can you describe the Festival of Dangerous Ideas? That's a very interesting concept.
Yeah, this was an idea that was hatched by Richard Evans, who was the then CEO of the Sydney Opera House, and myself. He'd been previously at the Australian Ballet, and we'd always wanted to work together. And when we sat down to say what could we do with him at the Opera House and me at the Ethics Centre, we came up with this idea, and we thought that there were many very fine festivals of ideas and writers' festivals, but there was nothing that really pricked at society and offered genuinely dangerous ideas that would make someone in the audience go, ouch, you know, that you can't be serious. And yet to create safe places where those conversations could take place would be a great service to our society, because we could see a kind of brittleness starting to happen. So that's what it's always been about, taking something which seems outlandish or challenging and making it safe actually to discuss it.
Have you got an example of one of the ideas that...
Well, I think in the very first Festival of Dangerous Ideas that we had, Kaiser Trad was arguing the case in favour of polygamy. And there were people who went along there and said, well, no, this couldn't be possible for a country like Australia, but actually began to understand why within a certain tradition it might work. So there've been a number more dangerous than that, and a couple that have been less dangerous.
How often does it occur? Is it sort of once a year?
It's been going now every 12 months.
Right.
It's part of the annual landscape. There's a good question as to, you know, do you keep on going with something which has been successful, or do you take time to polish it a little bit? So it's something which is constantly under review as to how you can make it better.
So the Centre's established itself with a reputation for excellence, and you have a number of organisations such as the Australian Defence Force, just as an example, who come to you and ask questions of you and have expectations of the Ethics Centre. I mean, when they come, what are they seeking to learn and to gain from the expertise that the Ethics Centre can bring?
Well, people come to the Ethics Centre for a variety of reasons. Sometimes there's been something that's gone wrong, some kind of ethical failure, and sometimes they're just looking for someone to help. You know, a bit like first aid after a bushfire, where you go in and there'll be a whole lot of people that are feeling very damaged, and we can assist in that by providing direct support for individuals that need it, and as well as that, other frameworks which can help people at least get over the initial shock. And then we've got diagnostic tools that we can use in order to be able to measure cultures. For example, there's a culture that people say they would like to have, what they espouse to be. And then there's the actual culture that they have from time to time. And understanding where those gaps exist, it's incredibly important, because where they do exist, particularly if they're large gaps, that generates cynicism and undermines cultures of organisations. So there's immediate relief for people who are suffering distress. There's diagnostic tools, there's education frameworks, all of these things which are brought to bear in relation to people who are either facing an immediate issue or who are looking forward. And this is the other class of people who say, actually, this is an incredibly complicated world. There's been a decline in trust in all sorts of institutions. What do we need to do to give ourselves the best opportunity so that our organisation can be sustained in the future and realise its purpose in a way that our employees, our customers, our suppliers, our investors all feel confident about. And so we've got a very broad spectrum of things that we do in that general space.
So do you think that corporate Australia, for instance, how do we compare to overseas organisations, and are they actually embracing ethics as a key component of their strategy, and as you say, being on the front foot?
Well, in Australia we're doing slightly better now than I think, say, in North America and perhaps even in Europe, although it would be an interesting question there. What we did, which I think was a mistake, was for about 20 years, from the mid to late 1990s through until only a few years ago, we focused almost excessively on compliance in a narrow form.
Right.
Compliance as rules and regulations and ticking boxes. And rather than that keeping people safe, it actually weakened the sinews, the ethical sinews of organisations, because no one had to practice making responsible decisions if all you needed to do was just tick a box to comply. The same thing happened in a much stronger form in the United States, which is very legalistic. When the Europeans saw the failing of that system, and maybe a little bit earlier than us, started to move away from that narrow notion of compliance towards a broader principles-based approach. But certainly in Australia, we've been, I think, very well positioned. So some of our regulators, like APRA and ASIC and the ACCC, for a long time now, they've been thinking about this issue of culture and its ethical foundations. And although there have been a few bumps along the way, company directors now are starting to recognise its importance. So I think we're set up pretty well for the future if we get over what is now a deeper challenge, which is being experienced around the world, which is a crisis of confidence, a crisis of trust in institutions. And that's not just government, it's not just churches, it's businesses as much as anything else. And we've seen a precipitous decline in trust in business and corporate CEOs. But the good news is that they're not just saying, oh, that's terrible or it's wrong, they're actually responding. And I sit in conversations with boards and senior management where they're saying, actually, maybe we do need to rethink the model. Maybe it hasn't been fair enough. And maybe the grievance of people who have lost their jobs or who've been screwed down as a supplier, maybe they're reasonable ones, and maybe we should have got there earlier. So it's starting to happen.
The Ethics Centre, I read that it's the only type of organisation in the world doing this important work. Do you think that Australia can lead the way, or is in fact leading the way with some of these changes now?
Well, I think the unique position of the Ethics Centre comes from two factors. One is the comprehensive nature of the work that we do. So under one roof, we deal with everything from the preparation of soldiers to face the challenges of asymmetric warfare in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And at the other end of the life and death spectrum, we have people who need assistance when it comes to an end-of-life decision in a hospital, and we're there to help everybody in different ways. And in between those two things, there's sport, there's government, there's banks, there's mining, anything you can imagine at some point or other. The Ethics Centre is there to support people and improve their capacity to make better decisions, which is ultimately what this is about.
Yes.
The other thing that makes the Centre unique is that we've got the world's only free national helpline for people who face ethical issues.
Yes.
And anyone in Australia can use it at no cost. And in fact, the range of people use it, you will have cabinet ministers through to farmers, journalists, company directors, doctors, lawyers, anyone. Now, we are in the process of taking that online, which means we'll be able to expand its reach. We'll be able to have, in principle, counsellors that we train, not just in Australia, but overseas. And we could actually bring something which has been developed here over 27 or so years to the rest of the world. So I do think that there is something really distinctive about what we've made here in Australia, which the rest of the world would benefit from.
And recently you were in Rome actually, attending the Global Foundation's roundtable. Why is that held, and what were some of the positive outcomes of that recently?
So the Global Foundation, which is led by its Secretary General, Steve Howard, has been working in very high levels of dialogue around the world for many years now. And in the last few years, he's joined together with the Vatican and a number of other faith-based groups to look at ways in which they can discuss things like the Sustainable Development Goals, and rather than have them just be airy-fairy rhetorical statements, actually ground them in solid commitments and practical engagement, out of a real sense for the respect for the intrinsic dignity of people. That these things matter not because they're a political agreement, but because they address some deeper and genuine need in human beings. So a number of people, the governors of central banks, big fund managers, people from faith communities, CEOs of major corporations, and people like me, came together in Rome for the most recent of those conversations.
And you actually had the opportunity to meet Pope Francis and give him a copy of your new book you've just written for children.
Yeah, I wrote and published at the end of last year my first children's book called The Spider's Song. And I hadn't known I was going to have that opportunity, but I had a copy taken to friends in Cambridge that I was going to visit after being in Rome. And Pope Francis accorded the group that I was with the privilege of meeting with him. And it wasn't just where we sat and listened, but we actually had a chance to say hello and shake hands and talk a little.
Great.
And the themes inside the book, in many ways, they echo some of the traditions which he belongs to, particularly given his name, Francis, and the importance of the environment and things like that. So I just wrote in the front of the book, this book belongs to Francis, and a little note as to why I thought it mattered, and offered to him, and he said, "What's this?" And I said, "Oh, it's something for you to read to your children in your extended family." And he was just totally delighted, and his face lit up. And so we exchanged a few more words about that, and he thumbed through looking at the pictures, which are done by a Dutch graphic illustrator, Mark van der Green, and they're really beautiful and compelling images. He was taken by them as well. And then I moved on.
Oh, what a great experience. Yeah. It's sort of one of those once in a lifetime things that come along.
It probably is, yes.
Well, just talking about children, I also noticed that the Ethics Centre has become involved with the New South Wales government and doing this primary ethics in primary schools.
Yes.
Do you feel that that is making a difference, as we talked about sowing seeds and sowing ideas and the impact that you mentioned of your school days?
Look, this primary ethics will probably be one of the most significant achievements in my career. It came about initially because of a question of justice. So for 150 years in New South Wales, children in state primary schools who didn't go to scripture or special religious education were effectively condemned by policy to engage in meaningless activity. Over the decades, some had been picking up papers in the playground, or sitting outside the principal's office, or watching the same video over and over again in the same library. And we just thought that it was pointless for children to be required to have to participate in such a meaningless activity. So we conceived of primary ethics firstly as a response to that, and then we made available all of the curriculum that we subsequently created to all of the faith groups if they wished to use it. It took us 10 years in total to get the law changed and the tax laws changed, but eventually we did it. And now there's about 43,000 students every week in New South Wales state primary schools who are getting the opportunity to be able to deal with ethical questions, which are common across all religions. So it's not denying anything, it's giving them something which is at a core. But there are another maybe 80,000 who don't have this opportunity yet. But the general idea that a cohort of children can be exposed from kindergarten to year 6, and then hopefully later on, to ways of thinking, towards kind of core values around honesty and respectful disagreement, they're the sorts of things the world needs. We don't need people who just yell at each other from either side. We want them to know how to think, to form an independent perspective, but to be able to engage with others in a reasonable way. And that will be one of the strongest points of legacy for those students, as well as equipping them marvellously for the world of work, where these are precisely the skills you need for the future.
Oh, absolutely. That's a wonderful initiative. And, you know, they say that the most formative years are really those primary school years. So to, you know, for them to be getting those messages early on, you know, hopefully it will make the world a better place. And just on that, I mean, do you ever sort of feel overwhelmed at the state of affairs of the world? I mean, how do you stay optimistic and, you know, positive when, you know, you turn on the news at night and there's a barrage of, you know, bad news stories?
I'm a complete optimist. And yes, there are many, many challenges, but I also know through my study of history that human beings have the capacity, if we wish to meet those challenges. And it's not because there'll be the sudden emergence of a Nelson Mandela or Mahatma Gandhi or some of the other great figures in history. My belief is that the world changes most powerfully when ordinary people like us, just fall the right side of each question when we're given the opportunity to choose. You might be in a supermarket. What kind of eggs will I buy? Will they be free range, they're slightly more expensive, or will they be the cheaper version? Well, what's that going to do to those animals? It might be in a negotiation where you could screw the last cent out of a competitor or a supplier. You say, no, actually this needs to be a fair relationship which will endure into the future. Little decisions like that every day will make the difference. And I think if only we allow ourselves to think about these things, then we'll do it. The trouble is that the biggest enemy of ethics is not the greedy and dishonest individual. It's basically good people who do bad things because it never occurs to them to think. They just do it because everybody does it. That's the way it's always been done.
It's true. I do buy my free-range eggs, you'll be pleased to know.
Well done, Nicola.
I mean, how do you switch off and unwind, you know, because there's it's a very cerebral thing, a space that you work in. How do you sort of find peace and tranquility?
Well, the first thing is there is a certain amount of brain work, but a lot of it's very intensely emotional things too. When you're I remember sitting across from a man who had been bullied because he was gay in a workplace, and everything he'd hoped for in his life was in tatters, and he was sobbing. Now, you know, there's this visceral component to ethics. It's the lived experience.
Yes.
But for me to unwind, music. Probably the thing I escape to whenever I can, but it's all too infrequent, is the opportunity to sit down and play and try and write music. Now, I'm no good at it. I'm not especially talented, but
that wonderful creative process.
It's losing myself in creativity, and I think also some of the writing of children's stories. I found I've been working on another one since then. I think for me, when I was at school, I did art and I was very interested in English and literature, and immediately after I left school and came back from the Territory, I was down in Tasmania and started to write plays, some of which were performed. In fact, one of them I think may have even been performed in Berlin. And that creative outlet where it's about building something out of nothing, whether it's notes in composition and the timbre of particular instruments you might bring together, or an imagined world where a dragon lives and, you know, it wrestles with its own lust for gold. You know, these things are...
and something of beauty too.
I think we have this human beings, we have this wonderful capacity, even in the most terrible circumstances, to find meaning and purpose in sometimes little things, to know that even just the integrity of our own self is the one thing that we create each and every day. And so that's partly why I'm optimistic, and it's difficult, but it's doable.
Yes. Well, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you today, Simon, and really appreciate your time out of your busy schedule, and I've really enjoyed getting to know you.
Thank you.